Hey everyone, I hope you're well and that these eclipses have been treating you okay. Sorry that I haven't posted about Bitcoin and DeFi market for a while. It's not because I haven't wanted to, it's just that I've been kind of wrestling with trying to see a pattern that has been eluding me for a little bit, and I keep feeling as though the veil is going to lift, the veil is going to lift. I just need to be patient, you know, that if I keep studying things, it will start to emerge, and it always just seems a little bit out of reach. So I kind of thought it's now or never. I need to kind of post. So what I've done is I've created a combined forecast for both the April solar eclipse and the May lunar eclipse, which will take us from the end of April right through until the end of October of 2022. So we're looking at macro cycles here, kind of sort of medium-term type of timing. So even though I will look at the charts to an extent, I'm looking at more longer-term energy. So I'm going to focus more on particular planets and the way that I think that they are working, particularly with Bitcoin, but also a little bit with Ethereum. And in the hopes that this can give us a fuller picture, you know, together with the Gann cycles about where markets might be going between now and kind of the autumn of 2022. So let's dive in and see what we can see. So just as a quick recap for those people who aren't familiar with the way that I work with eclipses, solar eclipses for me are new moons. So they're turbocharged new moons. They always happen at new moon, the sun and the moon on the same side of the earth. And for me, this is all about kind of reset. So it's about seed moments, fresh beginnings, pressing the reset button, etc. Now, generally speaking, they do occur in the same families every 18.6 years, and we call these Saros families. So these families tend to have particular identities, and they also tend to coincide with important market events, particularly if we look at the Gann cycle and we look at the Metonic cycle, which is this 18 to 19 year cycle that I'm talking about, between which the same eclipses repeat. And we'll see that there is an interesting pattern to do with the Metonic cycle in relation to the Gann cycle that I think is worth just sort of reiterating. But then on top of that, Saros cycles are interpreted differently, or they are grouped differently. So Bernadette Brady is the person that most astrologers kind of defer to when it comes to Saros cycles. And well, what I've realized is that she bases these on solar eclipses. So the old system, the Vandenberg system, tends to include lunar eclipses, and so you tend, if you don't use the Vandenberg system, you actually you're missing out on certain patterns that you might otherwise kind of see. So I've always felt as though something was missing, and I did mention this, I think, in my lunar eclipse forecast for November of last year, and that I felt that the Vandenberg system was worth looking at in more detail, and I have been looking at it further, and it does alter time periods and show links that you otherwise, you know, might not see. So, for example, the current set of eclipses, the 2022 eclipses, occur in Brady's 6 North and South Saros series. So you get the 6 North sort of at one point in the year, and then it's followed by South sort of in the second part of the year as the sun moves from one hemisphere to the other. Now, what's so interesting is that in terms of Vandenberg, you actually, if you look at both the solar eclipses and the lunar eclipses, you actually get 4 separate cycles that are based on the Vandenberg numbers 119, 124, 131, and 136. And these actually recur with sort of with regularity when it comes to market events. So I'm going to sort of like look at the sort of differences between the two and try to sort of fill in the gaps when it comes to the Saros series, because I think it gives us a little bit more information. So as I was saying, the 2022 eclipses, certainly the first half of the year, are happening in the 6 North Bernadette Brady system. So this is to do with only the solar eclipse. So this has to do with the eclipse that happened on the 30th of April in the sign of Taurus. So this kind of sets the tone for the next 6 months until we have the follow-up eclipse, which happens in the 6 South series. Now, this is interesting, you know, in and of itself, because it gives us a flavor of what this eclipse Saros family is like. So for Brady, this 6 North Saros series concerns relationships with authority, particularly patriarchy, and father figures, because we are talking about Saturn. Saturn's got quite a strong signature to this particular Saros series. And so does Neptune, actually. Now, and both of these planets are prominent at both eclipses in both April and May. Saturn, you know, will be very prominent at the lunar eclipse because it makes a square, like a T-square, to the luminaries. So it's kind of bringing in lessons and opportunities to grow and to kind of master things around leadership, taking responsibility, assuming control, and so on. So it's a time when we, certainly from the point of view of the solar eclipse, it's a time to accept more commitments or responsibilities. And this is going to be a theme, I think, as we go into the second half of the year. And it is also reiterated by the position of Jupiter in gate 25, which I'm going to get into further on in the forecast, that it lights up this the center, the will center, which is the center of leadership. So I'm going to get into that in more detail. But the Neptune element kind of comes in where you may have to accept more commitments or responsibilities as a result of people flaking. And this is the Neptune signature. So people being flaky, falling ill or not being able to show up, and you possibly having to kind of step in or take over. So it's about adulting in a lot of ways, and karmic lessons around that. So it might not feel very comfortable, but at the same time, it's an enormous opportunity to grow and to develop sort of like strong muscles when it comes to leadership and that kind of thing. Now, Saros series, generally speaking, they start at one pole and they move gradually from like the North Pole to the South Pole. It depends on where they start. They can start at the South Pole as well. But in this case, we are talking about a 6 North sort of Saros series. So we are talking about a series that began at the North Pole in about 850 CE or AD and will end in about 2094. So it's quite a prominent and long-lasting Saros series. It's quite active. And previous dates when we look at just the solar eclipses include 1914, 1932, 1950, 68, 86, and 2004. So those will kind of link to this particular to the April solar eclipse that we just had in Taurus. Now, what I was saying about the Vandenberg series, this includes lunar eclipses that are related to this the 6 North and South Saros series. Now, what's fascinating is when you add these in, you actually get some very interesting correlations with events in the market, particularly the American, the stock market. So when we include the Vandenberg 119 series, which is associated with the 6 North Saros series, we get lunar eclipses in 1909, 1927, 1945, 1963, 1981, 1999, and 2017. And these currently occur very close to what we term Metonic cycle reset. So we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail, because I think that they are very important when it comes to looking at macro cycles in terms of markets and market sentiment. Now, Metonic cycles. So these are named after Meton, who was a Greek astronomer, and he's often credited with being the first to discover this 18.6 to 19 year Saros cycle phenomenon. But actually, the truth is that he merely introduced it to the West, and he was he had inherited or kind of learned these principles from a Babylonian astronomer named Sidinus. So it's interesting how this tends to kind of happen, that, history is written by the victors, and the people who are perhaps really responsible for kind of discovering something are not always necessarily credited. But anyway, so this Metonic cycle, it's an 18.6 to 19 year cycle that helps to regulate the solar and lunar calendars. So, as we know, the solar calendar is about 365 point something days, so almost 366 days. And of course, every 4 years we have to regulate our calendar with a leap year because of the solar cycle not exactly matching our kind of artificial calendar, if you like. Now, the lunar year is 11 days shorter than the solar one. So during the Metonic cycle, you tend to need to have 7 leap years of 13 months to help synchronize the synodic kind of month, which is 28 days, the lunar month, and calendar months, which are 30 days. So the calendar months are the sort of the more kind of theoretical, hypothetical, based on the ideal of this 30 days. But the truth is that most lunar cycles are closer to 28 to 29 days. So the reason that it was kind of discovered was that these astronomers were trying to kind of synchronize the solar and the lunar calendar. And so a lot of agricultural and religious calendars, because they're based on the lunar cycle, if you think about the Babylonian calendar, which has been inherited by a lot of systems, for example, the Christian calendar is still to an extent a lunar calendar, and so that's why Easter, the date of Easter, tends to move, because it's based on the position to the first, I think it's the first new moon after the equinox. But anyway, it's the Metonic cycle is important for calculating those dates, but it's also connected to Saros families. As I say, these eclipse groups that recur every 19 or so years. So in that sense, this is what gives us the flavor of like Saros families. But I think what's so interesting is that, we've been aware of these cycles for a very long time. I don't know if any one of you are familiar with the Antikythera mechanism, which was discovered on a shipwreck in the Mediterranean, and dates back to around about between the 1st and 2nd centuries. But they found that what they think it is actually the oldest example of an analog computer, but it was used to calculate the Metonic cycle and things like eclipses. So this was really important to the ancients, not just from kind of from a calendar point of view, but also in terms of like rituals, ceremonies, that kind of thing, because their cosmology was all about trying to regulate the above with the below, to synchronize heaven and earth. So very, very important. Just as a kind of a recap for those people who maybe are not familiar with my work, because, as I said, we are trying to include now the solar and the lunar eclipses and get them to work together. So lunar eclipses for me are kind of turbocharged full moons. So these are about endings, culmination points, flowering, climaxes, and conclusions. So they can be, for example, when you get a market top before a decline. Equally, they could be where a market kind of crashes and you have this need for a reset. So they are great for kind of closing off 6-month cycles. They generally tend to have a shadow period of around about 3 months. And so that's always worth bearing in mind, that even though they might catalyze an ending or some kind of flowering, that this flowering may take 3 months to fully materialize or kind of manifest, or for something to phase out. Now, there may be links, as I say, between sort of the lunar eclipse kind of Vandenberg Saros series and some of the events that we've seen in the stock market, which I'm going to look at next. But generally speaking, lunar eclipses only occur when the full moon is within an orb of 12 degrees to the nodes. Now, the nodes are very important in eclipse astrology, and so we do need to kind of bear this in mind, because it does also seem to matter as to whether an eclipse is partial, total, or kind of annual. And so we'll get into that a little bit too. In terms of what I was saying about the nodes, we have these two nodes which are important to sort of realize, because it gives us a sense of like what Bernadette Brady's talking about when she says you have these north and south eclipses. So essentially what nodes are positions where the path of the sun from our perspective here on Earth crosses that of the moon. So you have a kind of one cross here and you have a second cross here. And because the moon's orbit is elliptical, it has a kind of a lower kind of portion and a higher portion, because of course the Earth is tilted to 23 degrees. So from our perspective, the moon appears to be sort of sometimes higher in the sky and sometimes lower in the sky. And so we have these two nodes that are called the ascending node and the descending node. And these are associated with the north and the south node. So the ascending node, you can see here, is the north node. This is the moon going kind of up in declination from the perspective of Earth. And then you get the descending node, which is the south node, and this is to do with releases. So I strongly associate the ascending node with solar eclipses and the descending node with lunar eclipses, and this fits with the symbolism you get in geomancy as well. Now, it's interesting because the ancients used to they saw the nodes as being almost like the kind of 8th and 9th planets, because of course they were working with the 7 planets up to Saturn, planets that you can see with the naked eye. They didn't necessarily have the sort of telescopes and things that we do now, and so the outer planets like Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune were only discovered in the I think the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century. So up until that point, astrologers were only working with the 7 planets, the traditional planets as we call them, and then the north and the south node. Now, as I said, solar eclipses occur when the sun is within 18 degrees on either side of these nodes. So the nodes are very important in eclipses. An eclipse can only occur close to a node. And the reason that we have kind of total, annual, and partial eclipses depends on the position, how close the sun and the moon are to the nodes. So solar eclipses occur when the sun is within 18 degrees on either side of the nodes. But it will only be total when it is within 10 degrees either side of the north and the south node. Now, and then the opposite is true for lunar eclipses. These only occur when the full moon is within an orb of 12 degrees to the node. So a slightly tighter orb than the sun, and I suppose that's because the moon is smaller, and within 4 degrees of the node to be total. So that's quite tight. So I think that's why lunar eclipses often tend to be quite powerful, you know, in the sense that they have to be quite close to the nodes in order for eclipses to occur, whereas the sun, you have a kind of a leeway of about 10 degrees, so you're not always necessarily as strong. Now the nodes travel clockwise, if we're talking about these sort of the annual cycles of the planets. So this is the reverse direction to the rotation of the planets in terms of the way that we plot them on an astrology chart. So the planets will be moving in an anti-clockwise direction, and the nodes will be moving in a clockwise direction. And this is based on the annual cycle. We do use the diurnal cycle of the sun when we're calculating things like the houses and the particularly the cardines, so the angles, but generally speaking with the planets, when you see them transiting through the chart in a kind of an anti-clockwise direction, it has to do with this this annual movement. So anyway, so there are two eclipse seasons, as I was saying, because of the changing declination of the sun. So we have this one that is in the north near to the ascending node, and then the one that is in the south near to the descending node. But the sun and the moon very seldom leave what we call the ecliptic. So this is the band of the equator that is sort of projected out. So the tropics and the equator that's projected out into space, and they don't really leave that kind of area, sort of strictly speaking, which is interesting because of course, you know, a lot of the other planets do. But this seems to be important when it comes to determining how strong an eclipse is, and also what kind of effects it may have on the market. And it's something that I'm still kind of wrestling with, but that does seem to me as though it's very important that if an eclipse is going to be influencing market cycles, it needs to be eclipses that are happening close to the tropics or the equator, so within that band. That seems to be where they are the most powerful, and of course this is where they tend to be total. So there's something in this idea about eclipses being total around the tropics, so the equatorial region of the Earth, which means that total solar eclipses, generally speaking, only occur in the 3 months between the solstices and the equinoxes. So, and we know that solstices and equinoxes are very important in market cycles. This is something I've emphasized quite strongly, that you tend to get trend changes at the spring and the autumn equinox. That tends to be when you get major sort of cycle changes. So you tend to get big crashes, or kind of the start of like a bull cycle, and vice versa at equinoxes. And then solstices seem to be kind of like these brief kind of peak moments where things tend to sort of like go up or down, or, you know, where there's a reversal of a trend type of thing. So they go, they sort of start at the equinox, and then they seem to sort of like reach a peak, and then they reverse at a node. I mean, at the solstices. So there's something very interesting about this relationship that I feel I need to explore more. I think it's also important to just stop and look at the human design gates, because this also, you know, gives us some more information about trends that are likely to be in play between now and the autumn. So for the first eclipses, we had the April one, which is going to set the tone for the next 6 months. We had the luminaries in hexagram 24 line 4, which is in the third eye, or the Ajna center here in the sort of head. Now this is part of the channel of thinking, the 2461, which links the Ajna, or the third eye, to the crown, and the two together have to do with intuitive understanding. So it's where you get these downloads, these kind of hits of information that just kind of come in from nowhere, and they move us from being overly rational or addicted to knowing the answers to things, to being more open and willing to consider new ways of viewing things. So being open to information coming in from the crown that might come from somewhere else, from some kind of other mysterious source. You know, whether we want to call it our subconscious, whether we want to call it our higher self, or whether we want to talk about it as God, or some kind of inspiring force, that this information comes in from the 61 and down to the 24, and then, you know, we start to sort of become aware of the information. So Richard Wright describes this as moving from being frozen or addicted to invention to silence. So there's less of a need to always have the answers and to know what to say, to kind of give this illusion of always being in control or always knowing, to sort of moving to silence and realizing that sometimes truth is experienced in silence, and that, you know, wise people often don't say a lot, and that there's a reason for that. So you know, reading this now, I think it's interesting that, as I say, I didn't feel the need to speak at the solar eclipse, and have been kind of reluctant to speak because I haven't felt as though I'm seeing clearly. Even though I did obviously get a download at the time, because, as I said, the information about the lunar eclipses in the Vandenberg Saros series started to kind of come in, but I still couldn't see it clearly. I needed the third eye to try and sort through the information, and I still feel like I'm doing that. So getting more specific, we're talking about line 4 in the center, and that's where we cross from the lower hexagram into the upper hexagram. So this is all about being attentive and cultivating mental clarity while being in the company of others. So I suppose allowing other people to give input, kind of a brainstorming type of a vibe where you're all kind of open and you aren't dismissing anything yet. You're sort of considering all options or possibilities before you ultimately make up your mind. So it talks about needing to look for the balance between the sort of easy default mental pattern that we tend to defer to and a personally correct one. So one that feels true to us, because of course truth, you know, I certainly adhere to Henry Corbin's view of reality, which is that there may be a sort of an objective truth out there, a kind of a collective truth, but certainly when we are embodied, we as souls can only see a truth from our perspective, and that's part of, I suppose, the miracle and the sort of the uniqueness of each person, and that everyone brings a slightly different perspective to the table. But here we're talking about aligning ourselves with what feels true to us, and this is a theme that continues into the lunar eclipse, where we've got a very strong set of aspects between Pluto and the luminaries, which is all about, I feel, aligning with one's inner truth. Particularly if you listen to my other forecast, I talk a lot about the sort of truth with Perseus, because Perseus is the constellation that's kind of highlighted with the sun, and the sun is all about solar consciousness, so it's about that third eye type of awareness, whereas the crown chakra tends to be more lunar, where you're more receptive and you are receiving divine intelligence or inspiration from outside of yourself. So this is about trying to feel inside by being attentive, feeling what feels right to us, by kind of going, does this feel right? Does that feel right? And just, you know, getting in tune with your inner source of authority, which is different for everyone in human design, to sort of get a sense of what feels true for you, and then starting to align yourself with it. And this is a theme that is coming through strongly with Jupiter being in gate 25, so the next gate on from this one, which I'll talk about, you know, in a minute. So this links the identity of the self center with the will center, which is associated with leadership. So I'm going to get into that next. But moving on to Uranus for a second, because Uranus is prominent at most of the eclipses this year, and of course Uranus is so strongly associated with change and with kind of paradigm shifts, quick paradigm shifts, aha moments, breakthroughs, and also technology. Now Uranus was in hexagram 2, line 2 of the self. Now this is very receptive energy, so it's quite interesting, because Uranus we tend to think of as quite a masculine planet, and the human design gurus talk about this as being a natural connection to an unseen source of guidance that defies logical explanation. So a lot of what I was saying about that crown chakra, about linking the third eye or the sort of conscious mind to the unconscious or the intuitive part of ourselves, that crown chakra, and that this brings in unseen guidance that defies logical explanation. We can often not say where the information came from, what made us look at a particular thing in a particular way, or go and open a book that had some information that provided huge insights, that kind of thing. But I think we're really being asked to trust that part of ourselves, and to trust the intuitive gifts and hits that we get that can really transform our understanding of a situation and help orient us correctly in relation to others. And I think they are kind of telling us that when it comes to the markets at the moment, that it may be better to try and trust your kind of your gut or your sort of intuition, as opposed to the more external sources or experts and what they're kind of saying. Although I think it's always good to try and correlate the two things, especially when we've got hexagram 24, which, as I say, is in the third eye. I think it's good to try and bring a little bit of that left brain into things once you've had your download, your right brain type of hit, to try and marry up the two hemispheres so that you can get clear about what exactly the message is that you're getting and what it means, and then orient yourself so that you can then take action or make decisions based on that more balanced viewpoint. So those are the key things that I want to sort of highlight. Venus and Jupiter did make a really wonderful conjunction to each other, which I think signals the end of a time of kind of sort of coming out of a dark and anxiety-provoking time. So I think that period that we went into in February, when the whole kind of Russia-Ukraine situation started to unfold, it did feel very fear-inducing and scary, and it was reflected in the markets. We did have a lot of like the fear and greed index, the fear needle. It moved right over to the sort of the fear sort of side of things, and we had a lot of volatility and that kind of thing. Seemingly induced by the Federal Reserve making some surprise and quite steep indications that they were going to make steep rate rises, and that sort of sent a bit of panic through the markets. And then, of course, there was the whole issue around commodities and supply chain and that type of thing. And even though it hasn't necessarily gone away, I think we've kind of calmed down and realized that it's not going to happen overnight, and that there are maybe ways to cope with it in the interim, even though these might not necessarily be straightforward or kind of ideal. So as far as the chart is concerned, I don't want to talk too much about this because, as I say, I want to talk about more general trends. But as far as Bitcoin is concerned, I think some of the key things that were worth noting is that, first of all, we've got Saturn moving off of Neptune towards Venus, and I'm going to talk about Saturn particularly in relation to volatility and in terms of Ethereum and stablecoins. So that trend is going to be important. Then we've also got transiting Neptune moving off of Uranus, and of course we know that that's been very tricky because it's been opposing Saturn in the second house since around about September of 2021, and that's when we started to see a lot of uncertainty and sort of trend shifts happening in relation to the 4-year cycle. Things didn't really go according to plan, and I think December wasn't really the sort of the blow off top that many people thought it was going to be. And I think it had a lot to do with not just the Saturn Uranus squares, but also to do with this Neptune sitting on Uranus in the 8th house of the Bitcoin chart. That was kind of almost like the FUD and the uncertainty was causing investors to sort of behave erratically and unpredictably in a kind of knee-jerk, fear-driven way, and that this was causing the price to sort of bleed out quite a lot. And we did see that right from September, when China started to ban cryptocurrencies, and we had this sort of the Evergrande situation that started to induce fear, and then we went into the sort of October, November, December with the Federal Reserve and that kind of thing. So a lot of fear coming from external authority figures that I think led to problems there. But Neptune's moving off of that now, so I think we should start to get a fade. The clouds should start to lift as far as investor sentiment is concerned, and I think the more that people trust their intuition and their instinct, the better off they're going to be. Because the thing is, transiting Uranus is going to be heading back towards this part of fortune, which I did talk about in February. And so I don't think that, all is kind of doom and gloom, and that is we've kind of in the crypto winter completely, decisively, and with no going back. I do think that there is potential for a market crash, but I think it will be later in the year. And I do think that we will see a rally over the summer, which I'm going to get into when I look at planets like Uranus and also Jupiter. So that's just something to kind of store away, to file away in the back of your mind. But in terms of final transits that I want to talk about in relation to this eclipse, we also had Pluto moving through the 6th house. You know, Pluto's been slowly transiting through the 6th house as it's moved through the sign of Capricorn. And it's created a lot of controversy about Bitcoin and the whole kind of use case. You know, is Bitcoin a currency? Is it the native currency of the internet? Is it a store of value? So is it some digital gold? It's created a lot of polarization even within the Bitcoin community itself. And I also think that that we can't get away from the fact that there are kind of certain power groups, or sort of how can I put this, that you do have these whales in the Bitcoin market that do tend to sort of move markets, and there's no getting away from this fact. So even though we tend to see Pluto as being plutocracies, as in outside governments and banks and federal reserves and that kind of thing, I don't think we should underestimate the fact that in the Bitcoin chart, Pluto rules the 5th house of speculation. And so, you know, I also do think that the whales in the market, we also need to start realizing that they don't always necessarily have the interests of retail in at heart. You know, it's a zero-sum game. Trading is a zero-sum game. And so as more in sort of institutions get involved, and they are by nature whales, so we started to see more kind of Wyckoff patterns in the charts, and less of a kind of predictable 4-year cycle. And you know, and these whales are kind of interested in accumulating wealth, the same as any other big institution. So we shouldn't think that you know, the Bitcoin market is free of greed, or that it's free of inequality. That's not the case at all. And I think it's just something that we need to think about, particularly as Pluto kind of comes on and off the Bitcoin Jupiter. You know, at the moment, Pluto went retrograde around about the time of the solar eclipse at the end of April, and will be retrograde for some months. So it's moving off of that Jupiter, but it's going to go back. When it sort of stations towards the end of the year, it's going to go back towards that Jupiter. And I do think that, you know, that could potentially coincide with some difficulties and with a kind of a crypto winter. So we just need to bear that in mind. But as I say, Pluto currently is retrograde, so it's moving away from Jupiter back towards the Sun in the Bitcoin chart. So that should kind of take the pressure off a little bit. And as I say, I think it's teaching us people not to take major risks, especially with leverage, because we've had several flash crashes that have to do with speculation, particularly on the futures markets. And as I say, those future markets to a large extent are kind of being dominated by bigger players. So we really do have to be careful about taking any risks and kind of mitigate any risks that you do have if you are kind of trading on a kind of regular basis because of these whales. So just something to sort of store away and to sort of be aware of, particularly once Pluto goes direct. Now, the major question that I want to sort of look at in this forecast is one that Jordan Lindsay kind of posed not so long ago, and that is the 4-year cycle over? And it's been on a lot of people's kind of minds. You know, Jordan talked about you know, the 4-year cycle potentially being broken by Wyckoff patternings as institutions take over, and that we saw that from June of 2021 when we had those eclipses, and you know, people started to realize that maybe all was not as it should be, that it was the 2020 was a very different cycle to previous cycles, and this kind of it dovetails with what Ken Stanfield is saying, which to an extent is about cycles getting longer. So he's saying that as volatility decreases, so market cycles are getting 43% longer, and so his prediction was that we would have a top around about the end of May 2022, which is 747 days from halving. So he's working in relation to halving, and he's working in relation to sort of block time, I suppose you could say, which is a slightly different way of working with time. But so that's something to sort of store away in your mind. We will look at that in a little bit more detail. I'll look at the astrology around that date that he mentions, just to see whether it tallies up with what the planets are saying. And then we've also got Raoul Paul, who's also talking about changing patterns as a result of institutional investment, that they tend to have a kind of quarterly balance sheet approach to things, where they sort of tend to divest once a quarter, and they tend to accumulate in sort of in short but sort of big bursts, which does cause markets to move. And that is going to sort of change the way that the it's going to change what the chart looks like, essentially. And then Willy Woo is also, he also kind of said that the current cycle is the last of the 4-year cycle. So he's saying that since the halving, we've seen 3 bull and three bear markets, essentially, which is interesting. It's a different way of looking at things. Instead of zooming out and kind of looking at 1 bull, 1 bear, he's saying there's been 3 bull and 3 bear cycles in this particular, since 2020, when we started the latest 4-year cycle. And he thinks that we're doing a random walk to $1 million for Bitcoin, because we're in a phase of technology adoption, an S-curve, which has 3 phases: hype, facing reality, and liftoff. And that this happened with the telephone, it happened with mobile phones, and it happened with the internet. And that he thinks the same thing is happening with Bitcoin, DeFi, and cryptocurrencies. But he thinks that because of things like social media and the sort of hive mind of digital interconnectivity, that this will happen faster than in sort of like in previous examples in history. So that's kind of interesting. And then we also have the Northman trader Sven Heinrich saying that there's a lot of talk about regulation in the market, particularly in America, but also in other parts of the world. And even though traditional Bitcoiners are quite anti-regulation and are sort of tend to be more kind of anarchic and freedom-loving, that really we should see regulation as a sign of maturity of a particular asset class. And what it does is it paves the way for a flood of institutional investment, because institutions tend to be quite conservative by nature, and so they want to manage risk for their clients. And so if they've got certainty based on regulation that they can protect themselves and their clients, they're much more likely to enter into a market. And this helps with mass adoption because it lowers risk and allays fears. So, there is that other side of the coin, and we will look at that, as I say, when we look at Saturn. So yes, I'll just kind of finish off with Jordan Lindsay, because for me he is always so great at sort of orienting my mind and helping me to see the macro story that's sort of going on. He pulls all these different elements together, so all credit to him. And I will link to one of his videos that I found particularly helpful in the description box. But he also talks about geopolitical factors being to blame in terms of the volatility that we've seen in the market since the autumn of last year, and and also the COVID crash of 2020. Although I must say that I did, when I did my forecast for the Virgo full moon, I think it was, I said that it was time for like a Gann mid-cycle crash, and I mean within a few days that crash happened. So I do think that the lunar cycles are important, but geopolitical factors can be catalysts. I really feel that they can be catalysts because they induce fear and panic. And we had the same thing in September, as I said, at the sort of close again to the equinoxes with Evergrande and with China banning Bitcoin, and then again in December with the interest rate hikes that we had. That were coinciding with those the third and final square that we had between Saturn and Uranus, and then of course in February we had the war in Ukraine, which disrupted trade and affected commodity prices, which kind of drove up inflation. And unfortunately this does have an effect on the Bitcoin market and the cryptocurrency market as well, because it is closely aligned still to equity markets. That link hasn't entirely broken yet. So if there's problems of volatility in one market, it's going to have contagion. So what is the likelihood of a major crash in 2022? This is what everybody wants to know. So as we've seen in terms of the Gann cycle, it's fairly high. We're looking at either the end of 2022 or the beginning of 2023. So in other words, at the 2 equinoxes, either the autumn equinox in September, October of 2022, or the spring equinox of 2023. So it's fairly likely that we'll get a trend change around about those times. In terms of Elliott waves, as I've said before, I looked at this in my last, I think, lunar eclipse forecast. Elliott waves, high possibility that we are kind of coming to the end of a massive period of speculation that's lasted for decades and decades and decades. So this is really the sort of macro view, and that we do a crash on the scale of like the 1930s. So that is kind of high, and I will link to my previous videos if you want to kind of go into that in more detail. If we look at the NASDAQ patterns, which are important, particularly when we're dealing with cryptocurrencies, because there does seem to be a strong correlation between tech stocks and things like Bitcoin at the moment. So in the two sort of previous crashes of 2001 and 2008, there tended to be a correction in March or April, so in other words the spring equinox, a rally over the summer followed by a major correction in September or October, so in other words the autumn equinox. So interesting that we are dealing with kind of the signs of Taurus and Scorpio, which are of course the bull and the scorpion, not the bear, but the bear could follow the scorpion. This is my kind of feeling. So if you're looking for, as I said, times of a major trend reset, those tend to be when you get them, is either the spring or the autumn equinox. Now we just had corrections on the Nasdaq, and I think those were correlated very strongly to the Saturn-Uranus squares. We saw that in February of 2021, again in June, and again in December. So that doesn't really surprise me as far as that's concerned, and I just think we need to keep an eye on on the Nasdaq to see what will sort of happen next. But it's a good indicator. If things start to kind of go wrong in the Nasdaq, more than likely it's going to have a knock-on effect in the cryptocurrency market. Now, a slightly more optimistic view is Ken Stanfield, who's predicted new all-time highs based on block time for kind of the end of May 2022. So the Gann cycle, the Elliott waves, and the Nasdaq patterns are all suggesting a higher possibility of a major crash in 2022. Ken Stanfield less so, and some of the planets, to me, are kind of pointing to a possible rally before then. But I think overall the sort of signs are all there that we are kind of headed for a major crash. But as I say, I don't think it's going to happen immediately. I think it is probably going to happen in the second half of the year or the first half of 2023. So this is just a kind of a pictorial view of Ken's model, and we can see that he's kind of, as I say, plotting things based on days from halving. So he's got the 2017 market peak, which was on the 17th of December 2017. I love all the 17s, and then he's predicting the market peak here again for Bitcoin on the 25th of May 2022, and you can see that he associates these with kind of lunar types of events where you tend to get this mass upswing in market sentiments, and not just market leaders that are kind of, he associates more with the halving. So similar to this idea of solar, eclipses resetting things, with a new moon solar eclipse, and then lunar almost sort of amplifying a trend before it then declines, with the kind of market peak. But those are his kind of dates, and as I say, I'm going to look at the astrology of that a little bit later on in the forecast. But now, in terms of the Gann cycle, I do like this for getting a kind of a macro overview, and I think it's so interesting because it's a sort of 20-year cycle of boom and bust that is keyed in, as I said, to the Saros cycles, the Metonic cycles, but also to the 20-year cycle of Jupiter and Saturn, which make a conjunction to each other every 20 years. So we had one at the end of 2020, which reset the sort of the calendar, if you like. And so the current Gann cycle, the previous one that we had ran from 1988 until 2008, and then we had a reset in around about 2008, 2009. And what's so interesting is that, every Gann cycle we tend to have a major crash and a minor crash. So the mid-cycle correction was around about 2001 when we had the tech bubble popping and the World Trade Center attack. So there it's interesting that you do also have a geopolitical factor that is that's kind of low sentiment, and sort of depresses the market, so making recovery difficult. And so that was kind of the last cycle, and then if we get to the latest cycle, I think 2020 was our kind of mid-cycle dip. So we're gonna look at that kind of next to see when possibly we could have the bigger crash. So as I was saying about the Gann cycles, the current cycle runs from 2007 roundabout to about 2027, and we can see where we are in relation to the Gann cycle if we just kind of go down this particular row here. So we're at sort of 2022, which in Gann terms is the end of the bubble. And his advice is to start selling because we're kind of reaching the top of the market, and the decline begins the following year in 2023. So this is the time to get out, lower debt, and move into cash. And I do think it's interesting that a lot of people are doing that, and that we are, as I say, starting to see a slight wobble in the marketplace. So in terms of the Gann cycle, what the Gann cycle is telling us is that we can expect the bubble to continue possibly for most of 2022, this sort of speculation and this bubble in stocks and cryptocurrency, possibly a major crash towards the end of the year or into 2023 and the beginning of 4 years of declining prices and recession. That's usually what happens in the Gann cycle. And then that's followed by a property crash in around about 2026-27, which is usually the best time to buy bargains in the real estate market. So that's the Gann cycle, and that's what the Gann cycle is telling us. But now let's try and refine that a little bit with some more information from like the Saros cycles and the planets. So this is what I've been kind of studying using my Excel spreadsheet. I'm trying to sort of put together a whole lot of things to try and look for correlations. And what I found with the current cycle, which started in around about 20. When did it start? 2007. Yeah, 2007. 2008 was when the Gann cycle started. But every 18 to 19 years we have a Metonic reset, and these also seem to be very important in kind of marking out periods or patterns in particularly on Wall Street with regards to sort of boom and bust. So in 2017 we had a Metonic reset, so we're now in this current Metonic cycle that is going to take us through until about 2035 when we have the next reset. So these kind of demarcate, I feel, the periods, the sort of mini periods within the market cycles where we tend to have, as I said, one major crash, one minor crash. And so we're looking at the period from 2017. And now what I've realized, once I kind of got a handle on this thing about the lunar eclipses with the Vandenberg series, what I realized is that at the moment every Metonic reset coincides with a solar eclipse, a total solar eclipse in the 1 North Bernadette Brady Saros series, and also with a lunar eclipse. It's kind of followed up by or it coincides close to a lunar eclipse in the Vandenberg series 119, which of course we do have happening this year. So these seem to be very important in terms of almost pressing that reset button or sort of like creating a kind of a cosmic reset, if you like. And they often tend to follow sort of on from or be close to big crashes. So I think they are worth paying attention to. As I say, I'm not entirely sure if each eclipse is sort of equal in the series. My feeling is that it needs to be a total solar eclipse for it to really like pack that punch that's required to sort of send ripple effects through people's psyches enough to sort of move markets. And what is interesting, as I say, is that every time at the moment we're having Metonic resets, we are having total solar eclipses in this 1 North Saros series. So you can see the next one happens at a total solar eclipse or close to a total solar eclipse, or this is what begins the Metonic cycle in 2035. So that will happen on the 2nd of September 2035, and you can see the previous one that started this cycle was on the 21st of August 2017. So that was the solar eclipse that's reset the Metonic cycle. And then we cycle through, in terms of Bernadette Brady system, we cycle through from 1 North, 2 North, 3 North, and so on, and we go through all of them until we get to the end, and we come back to 1 North again. So that's how she's sort of she's ordering her Saros series is based on the Metonic cycle. In terms of numerical order, but also what's interesting is that there does also seem to be a link with the 6 North Saros series, which I think I'll get into in another video. But essentially, if we start the Metonic reset at 1 North, when we seem to have a kind of a crash is when we get to 6 North. So in other words, 6 Saros series on from the 1 North, so around about excuse me 6 to 7 years into the cycle. Now this is not always true, and I think what we also have to realize is that sometimes that these cycles don't all run concurrently. So for example, the Gann cycle isn't always running concurrently with the Metonic cycle, and so these things aren't all kind of synchronized. It's when a lot of factors come together that you tend to have this cumulative effect, I suppose what we would call confluence if we're talking about technical analysis, when we do tend to have these major crashes. So, for example, in 2020, we had a confluence of a couple of things. We had, first of all, we had some eclipses happening. We had a lot of eclipses. It was a very busy year with the 5 North, 5 South series. And so this is just before the 6 North series, which is what we're in this year. And as I said, these do seem to be important. But we also had Saturn and Jupiter making a conjunction in December. So kind of doing a kind of a market reset in terms of like boom and bust, and that did coincide with massive upswings, a lot of positive sentiment in the market, and kind of new all-time highs. Which I think is interesting. And then, as I say, we did have that full moon in Virgo. It's sort of close to the equinox, the spring equinox, which did seem to be what sent things kind of into a bit of a downward spiral. I think I mentioned here the Pisces new moon on the 23rd of February. So it was that those two, the Virgo, it must have been a Virgo full moon and a Pisces new moon in sort of around about Pisces season. And Pisces season, for whatever reasons, the sign of Pisces seems to be terrible for stock markets. It seems to be when they crash and they bleed out. And that's particularly true when we have Jupiter ingressing into Pisces. And of course that happened at the end of 2021. Jupiter moved from Aquarius into Pisces in December 2021, where it will remain until the end of October 2022, because Jupiter retrogrades every year as well. So it tends to move into a sign, stay there for a few months, retrograde out, then turn direct, move back over that same area of the zodiac, back into the sign that it ingressed in before, and then kind of keep moving forward. So we're in that liminal stage where Jupiter will spend around about 11 months in the sign of Pisces, before kind of retrograding sort of out at the end of October, for a couple of months, and that may well be important if we're talking about potentially a crash on Wall Street. So there's that to bear in mind. And then the other thing, as I said, is that we are in that. This year is the year of eclipses in the 6 North series, so solar eclipses in the 6 North and 6 South series. So 6 North happened on the 30th of April, 6 South will happen on the 25th of October. So those may be important dates to sort of watch for trend changes. Now, the other thing that is kind of that we need to be aware of in terms of confluence is that we had the last Saturn-Uranus square on the 27th of October, which had a shadow that extended right through until February of 2022. And that's when we felt the most fear in the market. That's when we did see a lot of volatility and a lot of initial sort of downward price action. But Saturn and Uranus won't move out of orb of each other entirely until the 12th of December 2022. So we're still sitting with that energy in kind of at the back of our minds. And I think we do just need to bear that in mind, that there's a lot of factors that are kind of coming together that suggest that maybe, we could be heading for like a recession of some kind. But I don't think immediately. I think it's more towards the end of the year. So, but we'll get into more detail, in a minute. But let's get on now to the May Scorpio supermoon eclipse, because this is obviously going to be important looking at trends for the next 3 months. And so this is almost for me that kind of, we've had the solar eclipse, it's sort of reset things, new energies kind of coming in, and we will see that play out over the course of 6 months. Then this is usually followed by a lunar eclipse, not always. Sometimes you can get the lunar eclipse first. But this one has correlations to the lunar eclipse that we had back in November of 2021, which was in the opposite sign of Taurus. So there's an interesting overlap between those two trends. But also this kind of sets into motion a 3-month period of either a sort of decline or consolidation or release or a flowering. So one of the three. And I think it could actually, for me, coincide with with a recovery of sorts, and I'll kind of get into why. So just quickly, the Sun and the Moon in this chart are kind of trining the Bitcoin Saturn and Jupiter. So we've got the Sun sort of up here in Taurus, and we've got the Moon in Scorpio down in the 5th house of speculation. So of course that is always quite bullish. We've got the Moon with the part of fortune, which is also quite bullish. It's about sort of material wealth, abundance, accumulation, good luck in material matters. And then at the top here we've got the Sun with Mercury, and Uranus isn't far off, and you can see Uranus is approaching that Bitcoin part of fortune. So this is the natal part of fortune, this is the transiting one. So interesting stuff, as I say, that as Uranus approaches that part of fortune, I think it's definitely a day to watch. But that trine is very positive. The Bitcoin Saturn sits in the 2nd house of value, so it could, as I say, coincide with a slow rise in price over the course of the next 3 months. The Jupiter is, as I say, it's just ingressed into Aries, and it's moved into the 9th house of the Bitcoin chart, where it tends to expand things. So it's interesting that it's approaching the Bitcoin Moon. Of course, the Moon for me is about the people and about sort of overall or kind of popular sentiment. So it's a good indicator of retail sentiment. And so with Jupiter approaching that Moon, I do expect sentiment to improve and to increase. Kind of as time goes on, as Jupiter gets closer to that Moon. Now, Jupiter being in the 9th house, I think is interesting, given that it's associated with foreign countries, and of course we did have El Salvador adopting Bitcoin as sort of a currency, and it's possible that during this period that we will see more countries doing something similar, and that could, as I say, be very bullish for Bitcoin. Now, on the slightly negative side, Jupiter is also squaring the Bitcoin Mars Pluto conjunction, and this is quite, as I said before in the chart, it's very strong energy. It's very, it's associated first of all with the midheaven, so the future direction of travel, like where we're kind of aiming our arrows for into the future, and then Pluto rules the 5th house of speculation. So it does have a lot to do with the future of Bitcoin, where the future of Bitcoin is kind of headed. So for Jupiter to be squaring the Mars Pluto conjunction in the 6th house, which is the house of like the sort of the workings of Bitcoin, I think isn't necessarily that great, and it could point to the other aspect of the 9th house, which is about philosophy. As I say, there still seems to be a lot of confusion around how we think about Bitcoin, about whether it is the store of value, whether it is this digital gold, whether it is property, or whether in fact it is some form of currency that you use to sort of exchange on a daily basis to pay for things. And I do think the jury's still out as far as that's concerned. There are a lot of arguments to suggest that maybe it isn't the best kind of native currency for everyday transactions. Not only because at the moment proof of work is quite energy intensive, so it takes a lot of energy to verify transactions, but also because of the fact that the Bitcoin is limited in terms of the amount of Bitcoin that there will ever be. So yes, even though you can buy a portion of a Bitcoin, I don't necessarily think it's the most practical way to go about things. That there are other currencies or other cryptocurrencies out there that might be better suited to sort of more everyday financial transactions rather than Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin's too precious and too has such a store of value that it's more of a kind of a king or a queen. It's more of an asset than it is, to me, a currency. But of course, a lot of people have their own views, and there's a lot of, as I say, division within the Bitcoin community itself. And I think that the square can kind of point to that tension. Until everyone reaches some kind of consensus, you are going to have people working almost at kind of cross purposes to each other philosophically. So that's we just can't get away from that. So on a slightly more positive aspect, as I said, we've got the Moon trining the Bitcoin Jupiter. So the Moon here in Scorpio making a trine to this Jupiter here in Capricorn, which is nice because it buoys the Jupiter up a little bit, given the sort of the heaviness of Pluto, which is sort of lurking nearby, but as I say, is coming off of that Jupiter because it's retrograde. Venus is on the midheaven, which is amazing. That again is a strong indicator of wealth, that's sort of where we headed, is wealth. that does look very bullish, especially with Saturn, as I say, stabilizing Neptune here in the 7th, which, which does sort of tend to quiet down FUD and stop scamming and that kind of thing from happening. I've talked about Uranus. The only one I haven't really talked about is transiting Mercury, which is with the part of commerce. So transiting Mercury, quite strong here in its own sign of Gemini, in the 11th house of groups and sort of ideals and consensus, that type of thing. Which together with Jupiter are the most exalted planets in this particular chart. So that also looking quite positive in terms of good PR around Bitcoin and news that brings the Bitcoin community sort of together. So again, that's quite positive. I think, over the next few months, hopefully we will start to kind of find more that we're in alignment with things that we have in common rather than things that divide us. So those are kind of overall themes to be aware of, and as I say, I'm going to get into some of the individual outer planets in more detail now to look at particular trends. Moving on to Jupiter, which of course has always had a very strong signature in the Bitcoin chart, as I mentioned right from my very first article that I did on Bitcoin on my blog. Jupiter has just recently ingressed into Aries, and this has marked a bit of a sea change, I think, in terms of overall trends within Bitcoin. And I said when I looked at the chart that it's going to be in Aries from around about the 11th of May until about the 27th of October this year, and that's because of its retrograde cycle. So we had a similar kind of thing happen in 2021 where Jupiter moved from Aquarius into Pisces, and of course the very next day we had a huge market crash, which sort of led to the mid-cycle slump that we saw in 2021. And then as Jupiter changed direction and moved back into the sign of Aquarius, or rather moved back into the sign of Aquarius, it was still retrograde, in July. So at the end of the B-word cycle, we had a reversal of that trend, and suddenly we were kind of back in business as far as the bull cycle was concerned. So you can see that Jupiter's movements are very strongly correlated to Bitcoin's. Now, with Bitcoin, with Jupiter being in Aries, this isn't a fellow fire sign, but the Bitcoin chart has quite a lot of fire in the chart. It has, Leo rising, so this is going to be, I think, quite bullish for Bitcoin. And I think that what's interesting is that Jupiter will contact the Bitcoin ascendant during the summer, and I do think that this is when we could see potentially a market top, so the tail end of the bull market. It will also, as I said, be traversing through the ninth house of the Bitcoin chart, which I've mentioned already. So I do think that there could be other examples of maybe countries adopting Bitcoin and sort of integrating them more into their sort of their economic or their financial sort of ecosystem. But I think what's even more fascinating is that Jupiter will be, from a human design point of view, in gate 25, line 3. Now this is the center associated with universal love, and as I say, it does link the self or the identity center to the will center, which is associated strongly with leadership and also being able to make decisions that have a sort of a collective impact on others. So in other words, we have a lot more power than we usually do to make decisions that actually bite, that actually take effect, where the rubber kind of hits the road, if you like. So it's, I think, going to be a very interesting time. And what's also interesting is that Venus, the other benefic, and of course both of these were very prominent at that solar eclipse that we had in April. Venus will be in the corresponding gate 51, which is the gate of thunder or shock. So this opens up a channel between the will and the self centers, which has a lot to do with surprise development. So I think we could well be in for a surprise. If we think that crypto winter has arrived and it's not leaving, I think the next 3 months could prove us wrong, or we could get a bit of a shock. And as I said, it is very empowering when it comes to leadership. It does also give us a stronger sense of who we are and help us to stand in our truth, which I think is a big theme, throughout for both eclipses, because of, Pluto, as I've already said, and some of the lessons of Saturn. Of course, Saturn also in keying into the Saros series associated with the April eclipse is a lot to do with showing up, with bossing up, with kind of taking responsibility, with kind of walking our talk, but also sort of taking concrete action to actually make things happen. So not just talking about stuff, but actually kind of making things happen. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting that the 2551 is a channel of initiation. So I feel like we all, everyone who's kind of in the DeFi space is kind of undergoing a period of initiation. And I think this feeds into this idea of it being a new time, of it not being the same as any other cycle that's gone before. And also with this idea of technology adoption, that we're moving into a mass adoption phase with cryptocurrency. And that could really change not just the face of the sector itself, but also the entire financial system. So a really kind of a trial by fire period, if you like, where we're all in new territory to an extent. I have obviously been through the correlations between Jupiter and Bitcoin historically, so I won't really get into them too much now. But if you are interested in that, as I say, I have done previous videos where I go into these correlations a lot more. Because as I say, Jupiter in Pisces really doesn't seem to be good for markets at all. So I think it's worth just noting that, because going forward, that generally speaking, when Jupiter's in that part of the zodiac, for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to bode well for financial markets, certainly in the US anyway. But kind of going forward, in terms of dates to watch, I think what's interesting is, as I say, that the Jupiter will be spending the period between May and October 2022 in Aries, which is very bullish for Bitcoin. As I say, it resonates with the Bitcoin moon. It resonates with the midheaven and with the Leo ascendant. So because, of course, both those angles are in fire signs. So that all looks very, very bullish. And is in keeping with this idea that I think that this 3-month lunar cycle is actually going to be about the tail end of the bull market, which is going to be like the last sort of like hurrah, if you like, before we kind of crash. Now, this suggests that we could have a new possible all-time high between now and and the autumn. That there could be an upswing in sentiment over the summer, much like we had, as I said, after the B-Word conference in July of 2021. But I think the key thing that we need to be aware of is that we need to wait for Pluto to move out of orb of that conjunction to the Bitcoin Jupiter. And it's going to be in orb until around about July, 18th of July 2022. So I don't think we're necessarily going to have any kind of major top or all-time high before the 18th of January, certainly. But what is so interesting is that the correlation between Jupiter's movements and the eclipse cycle this year. So what's fascinating is that Jupiter moved into Aries just a few days after the solar eclipse that we had on the 30th of April, and it's going to re-enter Pisces on the 27th of October, 2 days after the next solar eclipse. So isn't that fascinating? So that definitely suggests to me a trend change that's going to sort of happen certainly after the 27th of October, which is, as I say, traditionally when we do tend to have market crashes because it's close to the equinox. So a major trend change in the market. So if we are going to have a crash, I think it's going to be in September or October of 2022. And of course, we usually have an all-time high before we have a major crash. So I do see the period between July and October as being very bullish potentially. And I think dates to watch in this respect are, as I say, May until mid-July. I don't see as being overly bullish. We might get a few sort of upswings, but nothing major because of Pluto. But then late August to mid-October looks very bullish because of transiting Jupiter making a conjunction to the Bitcoin moon. And then another period to watch, again, when things can sort of swing upwards, is the period between the 20th of May and the 1st of June. Again, I think just a sort of a mini, maybe a level, kind of like a leg up, if you like. But then the period between the 26th of September and the 11th of October, we've got transiting Jupiter sextiling the Bitcoin Mercury, and of course this rules the second house of price. So that looks very bullish. Another bullish time period is between 24th of June and the 1st of September. So again, indicating the time after the 18th of July as being super bullish. Jupiter will also sextile the Bitcoin descendant. So it's going to trine the Bitcoin ascendant during this period, and it's going to sextile the Bitcoin descendant from sort of early July until kind of late August. So I do think that this could be when we have a major uptrend. And then again, we've got Jupiter sextiling the Bitcoin Jupiter. This is super bullish on the 2nd of November 2022. And of course, it will be an orb before then. So again, I do think that this sort of the once we get past the 3 months of this once we get past sort of mid-July, I think, you know, certain terms of Jupiter, things are looking extremely bullish. Now, on the downside, we do have two indicators. So it's, you know, always a case of weighing up the possibilities. So we've got, as I said, we've got Pluto kind of on the Bitcoin Jupiter until the 18th of July. We've also got transiting Jupiter squaring the Bitcoin Pluto from the 12th to the 23rd of May, and again from the 6th to the 24th of October. And that's quite bearish. So it could be dramatic drops. It could be when we have flash crashes, that kind of thing, you know, like a lot of leverage being taken out of the futures market, you know, that type of thing. By whales that are sort of like looking to sort of knock people out of their positions. And also another bearish sort of time is transiting Jupiter squaring the Bitcoin Mars, because of course that rules the Bitcoin midheaven, and that's quite bearish. So that's kind of mid-June and mid-September. So it's a case of kind of negotiating all these dates and heading for the higher probability ones where you're getting a confluence of sort of dates. So I'll leave you to kind of pause the video and make a note of those on your calendar, and you know, and just see whether those help you to sort of to pick your way through the next couple of months. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of planetary transits and sort of major trends is Uranus and its relation to this idea of Bitcoin as going through a tech adoption phase, a similar S-curve to that of like technology adoption, which we talked about at the beginning of the forecast. So, as I was saying, this is something that Jordan Lindsay really brought my attention to over at Conquer Trading and Investing, Conquer the Markets. And, you know, Willy Woo is also quite big on this, that cryptocurrency is following the technology adoption cycle. So I just thought I'd go over this a little bit. So, you know, his feeling is that we kind of, if we look at the sort of the phase, you have the innovators in the early part of the cycle, which is the hype phase. So this is when you get, you know, people kind of coming in like the Willy Woos and so on, and sort of like adopting something early, but you go through this period of kind of like, you know, boom and bust quite quickly with the first couple of 4-year cycles. Then you get a bit of disillusionment, and then you get this period where you have inflated expectations that aren't always necessarily met, and you've got to cross this chasm of like belief, essentially. Take a leap of faith to move into like the main phases of adoption. And so what Jordan was kind of saying is, you know, this is where he thinks that we are, is that we're ramping up the stage of early adoption, and we've now got to make this sort of leap of faith across disillusionment, particularly as I say, when Bitcoin seems to be in a kind of a crypto winter, to sort of push through to the slope of enlightenment, which will then sort of move up to mass adoption. So I suppose the question on everyone's lips is, you know, will these eclipses propel us forward, like into this stage of mass adoption, or will a crisis event, perhaps some kind of geopolitical event in 2022, set things back and make things a lot more sort of bearish for risk on assets like Bitcoin until we get to the next halving cycle? That's kind of, I think, the question on everyone's lips. But I think, you know, it certainly does point, it helps to explain some of the volatility, along with Uranus, which, as I say, I do think is strongly associated with tech and with a willingness to be open to what's novel or new. And of course you have geopolitical uncertainty. So all of this, I think, will mean stronger correlations between tech stocks and Bitcoin during the course of 2022, certainly. So it's interesting that there's a lot of correlation between volatility in the Bitcoin chart and Uranus. And we saw that with the Saturn-Uranus squares, which occur roughly every 22 and a half years. And they definitely coincided with tech stock crashes in February and June and December of 2021, when we had the Saturn-Uranus squares. They all affected the Nasdaq, and as I've already pointed out, there does seem to be a strong correlation between Bitcoin and tech stocks, so that's hardly surprising. And we find a similar pattern when we look back at 2001, incidentally, that Saturn and Uranus came into orb of some squares, and there was a correction in April of 2001, followed by a recovery in the sort of the summer, followed by an even bigger correction in September and October. And I think that's more or less the trend that we're going to see this year as far as you know, equities, particularly tech stocks and cryptocurrency is concerned. That is my feeling, that it's going to mirror that sort of 2001 type of situation. And as I said, we did see some of the fear that Saturn Uranus negative aspects can induce in February of 2022, where people were at extreme fear and were very bearish looking at the equity market during Aquarius season, which I think is interesting. And so you know, I think this seems to corroborate the idea of Uranus often, because it's so unpredictable, creating volatility, and then often a lot of fear and sort of panic, people behaving impulsively or sort of making knee-jerk decisions that aren't necessarily well kind of thought through, which can cause sort of like jagged movements in the chart. Now, I also think the tech earnings seasons are going to be important. You know, we had some really incredible sort of earnings seasons or announcements in the first kind of quarter of 2022 with Tesla, for example, and so on. I think it's going to be interesting to see how disruptive technologies also start to upend the market, and how that could potentially increase volatility. But you know, but overall, I think we are seeing a huge trend with Uranus towards the adoption of new technologies, particularly in the areas of things like finance and food production and so on, because of course Uranus is currently in Taurus. And I think that that's going to continue. You know, I think the DeFi space is certainly going to be doing a lot more disruption in terms of fintech and the banking industry. And I think that's going to continue whether or not we see, you know, kind of high price action or not. And that's seems to be corroborated by people like what's his name, the guy at ARK, which I'll get in later in the forecast, particularly in terms of Ethereum and stablecoins. So again, we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in relation to Saturn, the other sort of party in the squares that have been sort of upending things, you know, over the last year or so. But in terms of like dates to watch with Uranus, we've got Uranus in orb of a trine to the Bitcoin Sun at the end of April, right through until November of 2022. So I think this could help to gradually encourage mainstream adoption of DeFi and cryptocurrencies, particularly, you know, as the year progresses and we get more clarity around things like regulation. Also, Uranus will be making a conjunction to the Bitcoin pot of fortune, so I've mentioned that several times. It reaches two exact points, one on the 2nd of July and the second one on the 18th of October. So these could be, you know, as I say, when we have these sudden blow-off tops. So definitely dates to watch. But of course, you know, transiting Uranus will be in orb for quite some time because it moves slowly, and it's also sort of going to go in and out of retrograde. So, but definitely dates to watch. And the third date to bear in mind is Uranus sextile the Bitcoin Uranus between the 17th of July and the 2nd of October. And I do think that's the most bullish period, you know, is kind of like from the 18th of July through into the autumn for Bitcoin. But I do think that things are going to gradually get a bit more buoyant over the summer, thanks to the movements of Jupiter. So I mentioned that I would look at the astrology around this date of the market peak that was initially predicted by Ken Stanfield. So here we've got the Bitcoin chart, and I've transposed the transits for that day onto the chart. I mean, it's interesting in a lot of respects. First of all, we've got Jupiter approaching a conjunction to the Bitcoin moon, which I've kind of mentioned, and that is pretty bullish for, as I say, overall sentiment, particularly amongst retail. We've got transiting Mercury approaching a trine to the Bitcoin Jupiter, so here Mercury in the 11th house. So again, talking about increased sentiment and good feeling amongst the tribe, the Bitcoin tribe. So again, you know, with Mercury ruling the 2nd house of the chart, it could talk about sort of price boosts due to good news, maybe the integration of Bitcoin into another payment system like Shopify, etc. You know, similar to the Lightning Network. We've also got transiting Venus, the other benefic, approaching a trine to the Bitcoin part of commerce. So again, that's also super positive. So here she is up here in the 10th house, and she's making this trine to the part of increase and the part of commerce in the 1st house. So that also looks very, very bullish. And then we get into slightly more bearish kind of indicators. We've got transiting Saturn, as I say, in the 7th house, opposite the part of increase, so kind of depressing prices, but at the same time, I think decreasing volatility, and this is the key. So in other words, like you have less risk. Your gains might be less, but you also have less risk. So the losses to the downside are kind of less, and that's got to be a good thing. We've also got transiting Mars approaching sextile to the Bitcoin Mercury. So transiting Mars in this chart, kind of just on the cusp between the 8th and the 9th houses, and that Bitcoin Mercury here in the also on the cusp of the 6th and the 7th houses. So just below the horizon, having just set, or just about to rise, because it's actually moving in an anti-clockwise direction. So I was kind of wondering, if this was sort of like potentially like a bullish indicator, because, as I say, Mars does rule the Aries midheaven, which is positive. It could be good news to do in terms of development, and in terms of like additional applications and use cases type of stuff, which would be ultimately bullish and move Bitcoin in a positive direction kind of going forward. Then slightly more bearishly, as I say, we do have that transiting Pluto, which is going on and off Jupiter as it retrogrades, which is not so great. That tends to dampen sentiment quite a lot. And finally transiting Uranus, which is approaching that Bitcoin pot of fortune, but is going to retrograde. So it's going to get there and then kind of come off again. So I've talked about that in a bit more detail. So overall for me, I mean, it's kind of like a bit kind of meh. I'm not really sold on the idea that this is going to be the top. It could be a time when we have a nice price rise, where people are thinking, oh, Bitcoin's pumping, and maybe like an increase of like 10 or like 15%, something like that, to a new level, maybe a new area of resistance. But I don't necessarily see this as being the date of like the market peak myself. So yes, Saturn, I think, a very important factor in terms of, first of all, as I say, stabilizing things and lowering volatility, but I think also important in terms of regulation. And this is where I think we need to see Saturn in a positive light. Saturn may be conventional, and it may tend to sort of like defer to what is kind of mainstream, but it's also cooperative, and it works within the bounds of society norms and conventions to create consensus. So in that sense, it helps to legitimize things and to sort of lessen risk, and to make things a lot more attractive in terms of, as an investment prospect. And that can only be a good thing, in terms of institutions. So in a way, I think, it's interesting that I heard this term being touted by the Frank, I wish I could remember his surname, from ARK Invest, and he was talking about how setting the rules of the road, that regulation will set the rules of the road, and this will actually help to promote crypto activity rather than stifle it, because it will give more conservative, risk-averse institutions peace of mind. They want clarity around laws, and it will make them more comfortable about investing in the crypto and the DeFi space, because they can pass on that sense of confidence to their own clients and their investors. So as I've kind of said, at the beginning of the forecast, Saturn is quite prominent, not just in these eclipses, but also in terms of the Saros cycle that is active over the next 6 months or so. And so I do think that it's going to be important for people in the space to start kind of showing leadership, and to kind of step up when it comes to maybe being a little bit more positive about regulation, and I think just sort of adulting a little bit. There's no avoiding regulation, and I think the sooner that we move out of this almost kind of teenage aversion to sort of regulation, and see it as being a more kind of as legitimizing and therefore encouraging mass adoption, the more sort of the better it's going to be for the space. It's going to help with mainstream adoption. It shows that an asset class is reaching maturity. So this is when the big fish are more likely to take a position. And we're already seeing this in articles like on Forbes, for example, where former skeptics like Mark Cuban are calling Bitcoin digital gold and cryptocurrency as money 2.0. And, I think, this can only be bullish ultimately for the space, because you need those big whales and things if you want Bitcoin to reach $1 million. Nobody else can afford to buy Bitcoin in such large amounts in order to affect price so substantially. So I think we do have to be a little bit more sort of measured in terms of the way that we see this kind of working. And, you know, I think it's also interesting that Saturn tends to be associated with late adopters, and we could see this more and more as Saturn transits through the 7th house, that more and more risk-averse investors, the late adopters, start to come on board, you know, the longer that Saturn is in that area. So this I think will really kind of help with not only stabilizing the price of Bitcoin, but also, you know, taking it to that $1 million sort of price point that everybody kind of wants. You know, because ultimately, you know, like Saturn, which is a sort of this responsible kind of boss or kind of father figure, regulation can create trust, and I think that's really the key, is that for retail investors as well, you know, they need some form of protection from hacks and from you know, exchanges going bust and that kind of thing. So I think it's really, we need to sort of reorient when it comes to Saturn and start to see it in a more kind of positive light, as actually doing the whole space a favor, essentially. But as I say, we do have to bear in mind that that transiting Neptune will move back over that Bitcoin Saturn from the 16th of October onwards. So similar to last September, when we had all that FUD from Evergrande and China banning sort of cryptocurrency, or Bitcoin in particular, that those trends could come back towards the autumn, which is when I do think we are likely to see a final crash and sort of the start of crypto winter proper. But yes, I think, you know, in the meantime, Saturn does have a role to play, I think, in legitimizing certainly the DeFi space, and I think also has an important role to play in terms of stablecoins. So I'm going to get onto that in a minute. So as I was saying, as far as this idea of Saturn is concerned, that with decreasing volatility, you get decreasing returns, but also fewer losses, which is what Jordan Lindsay was saying. So this I think is definitely worth noting, because I do feel like Saturn is stabilizing Bitcoin, and that this is partly the reason why we're getting longer cycles, is because these peaks and troughs are kind of leveling out. And so, you know, Jordan did a very interesting video where he looked at the gains between halving to the all-time high, and then he looked at losses over the course of the 3 main 4-year cycles that we've had, and you can see that losses are decreasing. So losses for 2012 were 62% versus 39% thus far for the 2020 cycle. Same with all-time high gains for 2012 was kind of like 24% for 2012 and 7% so far for the 2021 cycle. So here I do think that Saturn is helping to sort of stabilize things, moving through that 7th house, and I think ultimately that's probably a good thing, because it does mean more peace of mind. It also sort of reassures institutional investors who don't like a lot of volatility and sort of risk, and as I said, over the long time, it does help to sort of stabilize price. So I think that ultimately that's a good thing. It's interesting that when you look at the DeFi space, what's so interesting and has escaped a lot of people's notice is the case for stable coins, and as a sort of institutional growth area. And this is something I predicted right back in 2020, when I sort of said that I felt that because institutions are risk averse, and because of what Saturn was kind of telling me at the time, that I felt that Ethereum and the Ethereum network and stablecoins in particular were an area that would certainly go to interest institutions, and that therefore had a lot of growth potential. And it's so interesting that during 2020, Tether, for example, sales accounted for more than $42 billion in terms of daily volume, which is almost double that of Bitcoin. So it's the highest stablecoin by market value, and I think it's an indication of the growth that's possible, you know, in the space. And I mean, I think it's so interesting getting statistics from ARK. They say that issuance of stablecoins has grown 5x over the last 2 years, despite the volatility that we've seen in the Bitcoin sort of price action. And of course, it's attractive because the value is pegged to fiat currency value and to known assets like gold. If you think about the PAX gold token, for example. So you get less sort of volatility in terms of price action, and it's also great for cross-border transactions and for exchange trading payments and loans. And from that point of view, it has more parallels with the conventional financial system, but it has less of the sort of the problems associated with it, where you can't do cross-border payments that easily, or where you have to pay fees, or where things take too long to get from A to B, etc., etc. So, and what's also interesting is that certainly up until recently, a lot of the stablecoin sort of like staking was outperforming most banks in terms of yield. So a lot of accountants were considering using this to increase cash flow. So temporarily buying stablecoins and putting them into sort of like savings wallets, and then allowing that cash flow to accrue in value before exchanging it back into sort of like dollars and that kind of thing, just as a way to make the cash do something instead of just sitting in a bank account. So that's kind of interesting. Yes, I mean, I think overall, the fact that they are less volatile and that they are pegged to a known currency is reassuring to people, that they kind of know that Tether's going to be worth X in a month's time, so that they can do more forward planning in terms of like the financials than you can with, say, with Bitcoin or Ethereum at the moment. But of course, most stablecoins run on the Ethereum network, and so I do think that this is where Raoul Paul's arguments about Metcalfe's law is going to sort of like mean that Ethereum does have the potential to grow much bigger than sort of Bitcoin because of use case. If we look at the case for ETH and stablecoins as an institutional growth area, I think it's really, really interesting. There are a couple of areas where that sort of could drive this. The first being kind of proof of stake, that as Ethereum moves over to Ethereum 2.0, the sort of the foundation thinks that it will mean that ETH will outperform Bitcoin because of the switch of protocol. The proof of stake will be a lot greener than proof of work. Because of the energy savings once the sort of the ETH merge happens, which at this point is predicted to be in Q3 of 2022. So we'll have to see whether that in fact turns out to be the case. But that's certainly the hype. On top of which, most NFTs are traded or sold in Ethereum, and we are currently experiencing a bit of a boom in the sort of the digital art market. So that in turn may attract certain investors. So again, making Ethereum quite attractive. Thirdly is this idea of Metcalfe's law, the layer 2 applications and the use cases for Ethereum because of smart contracts and that kind of thing. But of course, there's still the issue around fees, which needs to be kind of ironed out. People are not really that keen on paying such high gas fees, and apparently the reason for it is because the network is so overstretched at the moment. Something that they hope will get fixed, as Ethereum moves over to the new mainnet, which is slowly kind of happening. So we'll have to see if that does improve the affordability for people in terms of transaction fees. And then, as I say, there is this parallel to the current financial ecosystem with banks, that at the moment the Ethereum network enables a full spectrum of financial services, which could eventually overtake third parties like banks. It's very appealing because there aren't any intermediaries, so cross-border transactions are a lot easier. As I say, most of the stable coins run off the Ethereum network, so it makes those kind of payments much kind of smoother and easier to do. And of course, there's the security of the smart contract as well, that you do feel like you have some kind of protection, that there is sort of everything's verified on the blockchain and that kind of thing. And also, so, it does have a lot of pull, in the sense that it is the second biggest cryptocurrency in the space. So it's seen as more valuable and less risky than other altcoins, and not as volatile necessarily as Bitcoin. And for Ethereum, for institutions, that's a good thing. But I think it's interesting that Frank Downing kind of his assessment of where ETH is in his latest ARC presentation, I thought was worth kind of pausing and looking at. He kind of talked about the upgrade as sort of from the start of the Ethereum white paper in 2013 right through to where we are now, which is sort of in ETH 2 kind of the upgrade started at the end of 2021, and the merge date, is predicted to be somewhere in the summer of 2022. And if that's true, and if it all goes well, then it could again be very positive for the space overall, and that again could feed into the good feeling that we, it seems to be indicated by the planets, for the space overall with planets like Jupiter. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But the claims for the upgrade are that it will make ETH more scalable, more secure, and more sustainable. As I said, the move away from proof of work towards proof of stake, which is seen to be greener. Although, the jury's out on that as to whether that in fact will be the case. We'll have to see. Some people think it could sort of a proof of work mining could accelerate the world's transition to renewable energy rather than proof of stake. We'll have to see, which sort of algorithm eventually wins out. In terms of security, the idea is that proof of stake consensus will increase both decentralization and the cost of attacking the network, because people will sort of, they have to put up collateral if they are doing transactions on the network, and they'll lose that if there is a bad actor that attacks the network. So it disincentivizes people from doing it. But it does put control in the hands of the wealthiest token holders, which does mean more centralization potentially. And it can limit physical barriers to entry. So again, that makes it a little bit more elitist. But I don't really think that's the issue. I don't think ETH is necessarily being seen as less elitist. I actually think that it's appealing to more of the kind of a different segment of these sort of institutions, and sort of the people that would normally be in the art market and who would buy these $1 million paintings and that kind of thing, and the people who would perhaps buy other assets that are sort of beautiful but also valuable, like jewelry or that type of thing. So I don't see ETH as being like the currency of the people, if you like. I think maybe Elon Musk has a point that maybe Doge sort of is, maybe has more of that potential. But I think certainly in terms of doing transactions and replacing traditional financial institutions, which are elitist sort of by nature anyway, it certainly has the potential for being the kind of cool cryptocurrency that becomes the sort of the de rigueur kind of currency of the moment when it comes to doing these types of transactions. I think stablecoins could be more where you have everyday use case scenarios type of thing kind of happening, certainly in the short term while mass adoption is happening. And before inflation completely deflates the value of fiat currencies. So in that kind of interim period, where kind of adoption is happening and there's a crossover from one system to another, I think ETH could really help with that. And then in terms of it being more scalable, the argument is that sharding and layer 2 scaling solutions will expand Ethereum's throughput to allow for more transactions per second, which should lower gas fees. But unfortunately, the scaling solutions have taken off more slowly than expected. So we have to see whether this does kind of happen, or whether gas fees kind of remain high. And I think there were a number of interventions proposed by people like Vitalik as a way to sort of incentivize people to do transactions in the short term. And yeah, I guess we'll just have to see whether that sort of works or not. But I think certainly as far as like smart contracts are concerned, in terms of the mass adoption of public blockchain ledgers as being a way to do safe transactions in other sectors, say for example in export import, for example, I know that this is something that's being looked at, that this could help with mainstream adoption of blockchain ledgers as a way to do to digitize or take online physical documentation into the sort of the digital space and allow for a more secure supply chain that can be sort of traceable, from kind of start right through to finish. So I think it's interesting that ARK is talking about how Ethereum has the power to overtake banks in this respect, to facilitate financial transactions, giving ETH an edge over other cryptocurrencies or tokens, as a result. And he kind of gives other examples here of smart contract platforms being open and transparent, not relying on financial intermediaries, and thereby reducing counterparty risk. But of course, this the banks are not necessarily going to like this. So unless they I think if there's a link to the stablecoins, they still feel as though they're not being taken too far out of their comfort zone, and you're still having this link to the traditional financial system, which I think makes people a lot more kind of comfortable. So yeah, we'll have to see what sort of happens, but it's an area to watch. So in terms of overall transits for this 6-month cycle, couple of things to note. As in terms of what's sort of happening within the space, we've got the luminaries in the 5th house, which is the house of creativity and of speculation. So in the sign of Taurus, and so I think really highlighting the sort of the art market and the NFTs sort of aspects of Ethereum as being a continued area of growth over the next 6 months or so. I think it's interesting that they are sextile the East Neptune, which rules the descent. I mean the excuse me, the IC. And this could actually help to stabilize the upgrade and eradicate any confusion around things like green credentials and security breaches and that kind of thing, and also around gas fees. There does seem to be a lot of confusion around all of that stuff. So I think it might help to stabilize that. But then transiting Uranus is also orbiting nearby in the 6th house, and this is trying the East Pluto in the 2nd house, which could stabilize the NFT market a little bit. We have seen some huge kind of balloons in price, like bubbles, and it could also facilitate important upgrades that improve the overall efficiency and value of ETH. So making it, helping to find workable solutions to galloping gas fees, especially with layer 2 applications. So it could actually be a good thing. But I think, with Uranus involved, we do need to expect a little bit of volatility. That's not necessarily going to be a straightforward up curve, if you like. It could have some false starts and that type of thing. I think it's interesting that the December solar eclipse we had in 2021. In the previous cycle, that Butalik talked about a quick and dirty interim solution for roll-ups prior to the merge to help that lower, gas fees. So it could have something to do with that. This quick and dirty solution could be what's sort of being indicated here by Uranus. But also we have to bear in mind that Uranus is making a square to the East Neptune, and Neptune. I mean. Mercury and Neptune, Mercury, when it's negatively aspected, can be a little bit of a salesman, or there's a possibility of it being a thief or a kind of a con man. So I think we do have to be a little bit careful here that about scams. Certainly in the short term, you could have people that use this idea of the ETH to upgrade to scam people out of their money. But it could also expose those as well. So, but I just think a bit of a Wild West sort of element that we need to be a little bit careful of, So just something to sort of bear in mind. And also there's a link to Chiron in the 4th. Here you can see Chiron, which is on the IC. That there is this link to Chiron, which can talk about security vulnerabilities. And I think that is always a potential when you're getting an upgrade, that there may be things that haven't really been thought of yet, especially with transiting Neptune moving through that 4th house of the fundamentals. That it's really important to get those right so that you don't end up with some sort of like security breach or a huge hack. Yes, so scams also possibly being exposed. That's another way that square could work. Transiting Neptune is making a grand trine to the ETH pot of fortune, which is in the 6th house. And again, I think pointing to this idea of scalability, use cases, smart contracts, the way that ETH has the potential to plug into the financial services ecosystem is where ETH could really gain in value, and I think does reaffirm this idea of Metcalfe's law that Raoul Paul was talking about. So the grand trine there with the pot of fortune and with Mars is interesting. This is the transiting pot of fortune and Mars in the 8th house, which does, again, to me, potentially point to some kind of ETF or fund, like some sort of like third-party joint venture type of setup where you're partnering with an institution or with a fund of some kind to then generate a third thing or sort of indirect value. It's usually sort of some kind of derivative. so, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what does happen over the next 6 months or so as far as that's concerned, particularly given the link up with Venus and Jupiter, which, we're making this conjunction to, to each other in the fourth house. And they in turn, excuse me, kind of trining the Saturn, which sits on the ETH ascendant. It'd be interesting to see. I think what's going to be key is choosing the right financial or business partners going forward. That if institutional investors and big money do come into the space, yes, it can be a good thing. It can certainly bring a lot of wealth and increase market cap and make things more legitimate and encourage adoption. But it can also corrupt Ethereum. So I think, there's the potential to also sell out, which I think you need to be very careful of, especially with Saturn in Scorpio here. The other thing is that Mercury is prominent. It's conjunct the descendant. You can see it here in the sign of Gemini. And again, this can be the politician, the PR guy, the thief, or the con man. So we need to watch this kind of trickster aspect of things going forward. Now, Mercury does rule the midheaven of the chart, so we need to be careful of sort of like a lot of hype and PR, and as I say, con men kind of entering the space either in the NFT space or in the financial services space, just to make sure that the credibility of Ethereum is not affected long term, or that people aren't suckered into some sort of scam, which could affect the reputation of Ethereum long term, and ultimately that would deter institutional investors and stop ETH from reaching its full potential. So I think a couple of dangers, that we need to kind of watch there, but also opportunities for growth, I do think, particularly in the NFT space, over the next, between now and the autumn. Now, in terms of Venus and Ethereum, obviously Venus quite prominent at the solar eclipse, so I think it's interesting that Venus is strongly associated with art, and of course this manifests in the Ethereum chart via NFTs and applications related to the creative industry, and I think that's definitely an area of growth, indicated by the solar eclipse over the next 6 months or so. So I think that Venus-Jupiter conjunction is interesting. It's being echoed in the Ethereum natal chart itself, where we have this out-of-sign conjunction in Leo and Virgo in the 9th house. So publishing could be a sort of a growth area, anything to do with like travel or sort of like legal matters, as I say, smart contracts, could be another sort of growth area, but it certainly looks positive for ETH 2.0. It seems to be a confirmation, being in the 4th house of fundamentals, that upgrade will be a positive thing for Ethereum. Venus in the chart rules the 6th and the 11th houses, and it's interesting because this is her Taurian and her Libran aspects, which work quite differently. So the Taurian aspect in the 5th and the 6th is a hard worker, but it does build solid, reliable foundations. And I do think that this, as I say, bodes well for the ETH network in relation to stablecoins and the financial services network. And then in her more Libran aspect, in the 11th, she's more associated with social niceties. So I think this is where ETH gets its sort of warm and fuzzy rainbows and unicorns type of reputation from. This the kind of peace and love vibes associated with it. And yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how the upgrade either affects how it affects the Ethereum community, whether it brings people together, maybe because people feel more positive, and if gas fees lower, and also in terms of the green credentials, whether that brings in a certain segment of kind of investor that is very aware of things like kind of green credentials. But then equally you have to be aware of things like greenwashing. There is a dark side that needs to be addressed, and that's the opposition between Venus and Black Moon Lilith in the 10th house. So as I say, with the institutional involvement and big money, you do have to be careful of corruption and of greenwashing. So like Michael Moore suggested in his film that he did about the sort of like the green industry, that you have to be very careful about who you get into bed with. So, and that the green movement maybe made a little bit of a mistake in getting into bed with big corporations in terms of these like carbon offsetting schemes and that type of thing. A lot of them turned out to be scams. And so you have to be careful of things like greenwashing. And this is where the blockchain can be useful. It can actually help to monitor and sort of provide information that people can monitor to see whether in fact greenwashing is happening, or whether in fact the claims that people are making in the sort of the PR bump is actually true. So, you know, in that sense, you could use the blockchain technology to improve credibility rather than detract from it. So, and of course the art world itself is full of scams. So, you know, that Black Moon Lilith, I think, is an interesting one, and it's Ethereum's blind spot. I think that where you get this type of rainbows and unicorns, peace and love thing, there also tends to be an element of sometimes self-indulgence and also greed creeping in, and people also don't want to sort of own up to the kind of the dark side of stuff. There tends to be a little bit of denial going on. So just sort of something to be aware of. So yeah, that's it for me. Quite a long one this time, but as I said, it is a 6-month forecast, so hopefully you can come back and revisit this in due course in sort of bite-sized chunks. But, you know, if I'm going to sort of go all in, I sort of go all in and do it all at once. So I hope you have found this helpful in some way, and that you've got some meat out of it. If you're interested, check out my blog, which you can get to at blog.astrologysphere.com, where I do write occasional articles about things other than Bitcoin, current affairs, celebrities, politics, that type of thing. Yeah, but I hope that all goes well for you over the next 6 months or so. As I said, it is an interesting time for us all, geopolitically and, you know, for the crypto space. So hopefully it's kind of certainly for the foreseeable 6 months an upward trend rather than a downward trend. But happy trading, take it easy out there, and I'll see you again in 6 months or so.